Good evening. Tonight we're coming back to the study that we've been doing in a book that's called Delighting in the Trinity, an Introduction to the Christian Faith by Michael Reeves. And we're actually going to finish the book up tonight with chapter 5. The last couple of chapters I've tried to summarize and teach from rather than read like I did the first couple of chapters. But this last chapter is so wonderfully written that as I looked at it, I thought it would be much better and much more effective to go back to reading from it for you. Now, I won't read all of it, but I'm going to read parts of it. In chapter 5, this final chapter is called, "Who Among the Gods is Like You, O Lord?" For the last 200 years or so, atheism in the West has been marching forward with ever more confidence and power. Its cries have not only heartened the person on the street who would simply rather do without God and religion, they have also inspired a new, ultra-aggressive squad of anti-theists. Leaping past the frontline argument that there is no God, these anti-theists have pushed on to argue that even were God to exist, that would be a bad thing. Belief in God is not so much like the child's comfort blanket. It's like the child's nightmare. Why? The argument is both fascinating and deeply revealing. Christopher Hitchens, author of God is Not Great, and one of the four horsemen of the militant new anti-theism, or new atheism as they put it like this: I think it would be rather awful if it was true, if there was a permanent, total, round-the-clock divine supervision and invigilation of everything you did. You would never have a waking or sleeping moment when you weren't being watched and controlled and supervised by some celestial entity from the moment of your conception to the moment of your death. It would be like living in North Korea, he wrote. For Hitchens, God is the ruler, and so must by definition be a Stalin in the sky, a big brother. And who in their right mind would ever want such a being to exist? In other words, the anti-theist problem is not so much with the existence of God as with the character of God. He will write and fight against the existence of God because he's repelled by the thought of that sort of being. That God is not great. But the triune God is not that God. Hitchens clearly had it in his head that God is fundamentally the ruler, the one in charge, characterized by supervision and invigilation. The picture changes entirely, though, if God is fundamentally the most kind and loving Father and only ever exercises his rule as who he is, as a Father. In that case, living under his roof is not like living in North Korea at all, but like living in the household of the sort of caring father Hitchens himself wished for. Is it too much of coincidence that the advance of atheism parallels the retreat of the church on the subject of the Trinity? The 19th century was the century where Marx dismissed religion as the opium of the masses or the opium of the people, and where Nietzsche declared God is dead. And it was the century that opened with its perhaps most eminent theologian, Friedrich Schleiermacher, making the Trinity a mere appendix to the Christian faith. It was the century that closed with his greatest successor, Adolf von Harnack, dismissing the Trinity altogether as a bundle of philosophical rot. Of course, the theologians weren't feeding the atheist, but they were disarming the church so that the atheist could storm on without meeting much serious opposition. For if God is not a father, if he has no son and will have no children, then he must be lonely, distant, and unapproachable. If he is not triune and so not essentially loving, then no God at all just looks better. The atheists are not alone in this. The popular turn to various alternative spiritualities from New Age and neo-paganism to Wicca and plain old superstition is routinely connected with a dislike for the idea of a personal God. For surely isn't such a being at best a monstrous bore, and at worst something much, much darker? In my own experience talking with non-Christian students, again and again I find that when they describe the God they don't believe in, he sounds more like Satan than like the loving Father of Jesus Christ. He sounds greedy, selfish, trigger-happy, and entirely devoid of love. And if God is not Father, Son, and Spirit, aren't they right? But how radically and overwhelmingly different is the God of the Bible? Not needy, solitary, or selfish, but bountiful, loving, and self-giving at the very heart of who he is. The theologian Karl Barth wrote, "The triunity of God is the secret of his beauty. If we deny this, we at once have a God without radiance and without joy and without humor, a God without beauty. Losing the dignity and power of real divinity, he also loses his beauty. But if we keep to this, that the one God is Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, we cannot escape the fact, either in general or in detail, that apart from anything else, God is also beautiful. If God is not Father, Son, and Spirit, then he is eminently rejectable, without love, radiance, or beauty. Who would want such a God to have any power or even to exist? The triune living God of the Bible is beauty. Here is a God we can really want, and whose sovereignty we can wholeheartedly rejoice in. If God were not personal, he could not be merciful. Things do not show mercy. But if God were just one person, then love of the other would not be central to his being. There would have been nobody in eternity for him to love. Thus, the only God inherently inclined to show mercy is the Father who has eternally loved his Son by his Spirit. Only with this God do such winning qualities as love and mercy rank highly. It's crucially important then that Christians be clear and specific about which God we believe in. We must not be heard to believe in just any God, but in this God. Today that seems especially vital, and it's not just for the sake of unbelievers. John Calvin said that the sinful human mind is like a perpetual factory of idols, meaning that we're all constantly distorting the nature of God in our minds, making the Father of lights out to be less than he is and devilish. In fact, this tendency is the very source of all spiritual coldness, for when we suspect that God is really a Stalin in the sky, of course we run from him. But the triune being of God changes the flavor and meaning of every word we use about him. His glory, for example, is entirely different than the glory of any other God. His power and justice quite unique. In fact, when we speak of God's characteristic, God's majesty, say, and we are clear that we are referring to the majesty of the Father, Son, and Spirit, then God's majesty shows itself to be something infinitely more beautiful than we otherwise could have seen. Of course, for now, we have distinguished the majesty of the living God from the majesty of idols. Let us take God's majesty as an example. If Aristotle's God, the unmoved mover, were God, then his majesty would be entirely and only forbidding. Aristotle believed that the perfection of God's majesty means that everything else is beneath his consideration. Why would God ever think about anything else when he has his own perfect majesty to contemplate? His majesty would mean our consignment to irrelevance for him. But if God is an outgoing God, if fundamentally he's a life-giving Father for whom love of the other is central to his being, then his majesty must be outgoing. And that is just what we see in Scripture. God's majesty is displayed when he goes out and acts, when he saves his people, when he shakes evil from the earth. His majesty is a loving majesty. Consider the clash of images in Psalm 113. Who is like the Lord our God, the one who sits enthroned on high, who stoops down to look on the heavens and the earth? He raises the poor from the dust and lifts the needy from the ash heap. What I'd like to do with the rest of this chapter is to see how the triune being of God shapes some of the words we use about him. In other words, to see some of the differences the Trinity makes to how we think about God. And through it all, I'll be turning especially to Jonathan Edwards for help. In this area, as in many areas, he is, I have found, uncannily far-seeing, clear, and yes, helpful. Now, we use a lot of words to describe God, and I don't want to turn this into a hulking beast of a book, so we'll just get a taste, as it were, and look at three pivotal areas: God's holiness, God's wrath, and God's glory. How does the Trinity brighten and define them? First up, God's holiness. Oh dear, you might sigh, and I'd understand, for without the Trinity, holiness does have the smell of mothballs about it, the look of a Victorian matron administering castor oil. And much of what purports to be holiness has just that aura about it, all prickliness and prudery. People even say things like, yes, God is loving, but He is also holy, as if holiness is an unloving thing, the cold side of God that stops God from being too loving. Balderdash, poppycock. Those aren't English words, are they? Or at least it is if you were talking about the holiness of the Father, Son, and Spirit. No, said Jonathan Edwards, holiness is a most beautiful, lovely thing. Men are apt to drink in strange notions of holiness from their childhood as if it were a melancholy, morose, sour, and unpleasant thing, but there is nothing in it but what is sweet and ravishingly lovely. 'Tis the highest beauty and amiableness, vastly above all other beauties. 'Tis a divine beauty. What is holiness, then? The words used for holiness in the Bible have the basic meaning of being set apart, but there our troubles begin, because naturally I think I'm lovely. So if God is set apart from me, I assume the problem is with Him. And I can do all this in the subtlest, most subconscious way. His holiness looks like a prissy rejection of my happy, healthy loveliness. Dare I burst my own bubble now? I must. For the reality is that I am the cold, selfish, vicious one, full of darkness and dirtiness, and God is holy, set apart from me, precisely in that He is not like that. He is not set apart from us in priggishness, but by the fact that there are no such ugly traits in Him as there are in us. Edwards wrote, God is God, and distinguished from, that is, set apart from all other beings and exalted above them, chiefly by His divine beauty. Now, the holiness of a single person God would be something quite different. His holiness would be about being set apart away from others. In other words, His holiness would be all about aloof distance. But the holiness of the Father, Son, and Spirit is all about love. Given who this God is, it must be. Edwards again, both the holiness and happiness of the Godhead consist in this love. As we have already proved, all creatures' holiness, or all creature holiness, consists essentially and summarily in love to God and love to other creatures. So does the holiness of God consist in His love, especially in the perfect and intimate union and love there is between the Father and the Son. The holiness of the triune God is the perfection, beauty, and absolute purity of the love there is between the Father and the Son. There's nothing grubby or abusive about the love of this God, and thus He is holy. My love is naturally all perverse and misdirected, but His love is set apart from mine in perfection. And so the holiness of the triune God does not moderate or cool His love. His holiness is the lucidity and spotlessness of His overflowing love. It all dramatically affects what it means for the believer to be holy, to be godly. In other words, what it means to be like God. Being like another God would look quite different. If God is a being curved in on Himself, then to be like Him, I should be like that. If Aristotle's eternally introspective God is God, then plenty of navel-gazing seems to be just what's called for. For what we think God is must shape our godliness. And what we think godliness is reveals what we think of God. So what, for example, if love and relationship were not central to God's being? Then they wouldn't feature for me either as I sought to grow in godlikeness. Forget others. If God is all single and solitary, be a hermit. If God is cruel and haughty, be cruel and haughty. If God is the sort of oversexed, beer-sloshing war god beloved of the Vikings, be like that. Though please don't. But with this God, no wonder the two greatest commandments are love the Lord your God and love your neighbor as yourself. For that is being like this God, sharing the love the Father and Son have for each other, and then like them overflowing with that love to the world. Holiness means fellowship with the Lord and fellowship with others. Love for the Lord, love for neighbor, that is the heart of holiness and how the triune God's people get to be like Him. The beautiful, loving holiness of this God makes true godliness a warm, attractive, delightful thing. It's not about becoming more mean and pinched, for this God is not mean and pinched. Holiness for God, said Edwards, is as it were the beauty and sweetness of the divine nature, and so Christians that shine by reflecting the light of the Sun of Righteousness do shine with the same sort of brightness, the same mild, sweet, and pleasant beams. And most essentially, to know and enjoy the God who is love means becoming like Him, loving. Now, if God's holiness can seem off-putting, His wrath can seem hideous. And if God is not triune, it is. If God is just the biggest boy in the school who must have his every way or else lose it in fits of carpet-biting rage, then His anger is repellent. All His other good qualities would be as nothing when we saw those red eyes. Yet that is just how God's anger is often seen. But, in fact, let me say that again, but, however it might be with other gods, that's just not how it is with the Father, Son, and Spirit. With this God, it's not as if sometimes He has love and sometimes He has wrath, as if those different moods, or those are different moods, so that when He's feeling one, He's not feeling the other. No, for all eternity, the Father was loving His Son, but never once was He angry. Why? Because there was nothing to be angry with until Adam sinned in Genesis 3. So God's anger at evil from Genesis 3 onward is a new thing. It's how the God who is love responds to evil. Like God's holiness, then, His wrath is not something that sits awkwardly next to His love, nor is it something unrelated to His love. God is angry at evil because He loves. Isaiah speaks of the pouring out of God's wrath as His strange work, His alien task in Isaiah 28:21, because it's not that God is naturally angry, but that evil provokes Him. In His pure love, God cannot tolerate evil. That makes complete sense to me as a father. If I could twiddle my thumbs and yawn while my daughters suffered, it would prove I didn't really love them. But precisely because I love them, I hate the thought of anything evil befalling them. How much more is it so with the Father of lights, in whom there is no darkness at all? Love cares, and that means it cannot be indifferent to evil. Romans 12:9 says, love must be sincere. Hate what is evil. Cling to what is good. Only such love is sincere. Croatian theologian Miroslav Volf has described how it took the horrors of ethnic warfare happening around him to appreciate the goodness of God's wrath. He said, I used to think that wrath was unworthy of God. Isn't God love? Shouldn't divine love be beyond wrath? God is love, and God loves every person and every creature. That's exactly why God is wrathful against some of them. My last resistance to the idea of God's wrath was a casualty of the war in the former Yugoslavia, the region from which I come. According to some estimates, 200,000 people were killed and over 3 million people were displaced. My villages and cities were destroyed. My people shelled day in and day out, some of them brutalized beyond imagination. And I could not imagine God not being angry. Or think of Rwanda in the last decade of the past century, where 800,000 people were hacked to death in 100 days. How did God react to that carnage? By doting on the perpetrators in a grandfatherly fashion? By refusing to condemn the bloodbath, but instead affirming the perpetrator's basic goodness? Wasn't God fiercely angry with them? Though I used to complain about the indecency of the idea of God's wrath, I came to think that I would have to rebel against a God who wasn't wrathful at the sight of the world's evil. God isn't wrathful in spite of being love. God is wrathful because God is love. Is God really impelled by love, though? Is there then some deeper and perhaps selfish motivation in God? Not love, but a craving for applause. It all depends on what the glory of God means. In the Old Testament, the word for glory had to do with heaviness or weight. So the glory of something is its mass, its bulk, its worth, what makes it up, what it's all about indeed, what makes it itself. Someone's glory might be his or her brain, his or her job, or looks, or money. It's whatever they treasure. That all means that glorifying God cannot be about inflating, improving, or expanding Him. That's quite impossible with the God who's already superabundant and overflowing with life. Instead, when we give God the glory, we simply ascribe to Him what is already His, declaring Him to be as He truly is. So what is the glory of this God, the triune God? What is it like? It will, of course, be a radically different sort of glory from that of any other God. This God is simply nothing like any others. The answer is surprising. Ezekiel 1 speaks of God's glory in terms of both a person and a light or brightness or radiance. Ezekiel writes of how when he was standing by the river, he saw a throne approaching, carried by 4 great living creatures, and on the throne was a figure like that of a man, and he, the man, looked like a fire, and brilliant light surrounded him. Like the appearance of a rainbow in the clouds on a rainy day, so was the radiance around him. This was the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord. The appearance of the glory then looks both like a man and a brilliant light. First of all, the light. You wouldn't expect God's weight to be described as being like light, but Ezekiel is simply recording something seen throughout the Bible, that God's glory, His nature and character, is like a pure and dazzling light radiating outward and shining forth. And he gives examples of how through the Old Testament we see God manifesting His presence, His glory among His people through light, through the glory cloud, the Shekinah, the glory of God. So the glory of God is like radiant light, shining out, enlightening, and giving life. And that is what the innermost being and weight of God is like. He is a son of light, life, and warmth, always shining out. As the Father gives out life and being to the Son, as the Father and the Son breathe out the Spirit, so the Spirit breathes out life into the world. The glory of this God is radiant and outgoing. As the sun gives of its own light and heat, so this God glories in giving Himself. Again, Jonathan Edwards. What God has in view is neither of them, neither in His manifesting His glory to the understanding nor communication to the heart, is not that He may receive, but that He may go forth. The main end of His shining forth is not that He may have His rays reflected back to Himself, but that the rays may go forth. In other words, the beautiful glory of the triune God is radiating, self-giving, and loving. Thus, the idea that God's glory might be something different in God at odds with His love is a complete misunderstanding. For His glory is not about taking, but giving. Love is the light and glory which are about the throne on which God sits. That's what John Owen said. And then John Owen also wrote that God glorifies Himself in the communication of all good things. Indeed, and particularly in the communication, the sharing of Himself. But wait a moment. In the Exodus, God glorifies Himself through judging Egypt. In Exodus 24:17, it says, "The glory of the Lord looked like a consuming fire." Well, that looks like a very different sort of glory. But in fact, it's not. One of the loveliest things about light is that it overcomes and banishes darkness. Edwards said the same spiritual sun whose beams are most comfortable and beneficial to believers will burn and destroy unbelievers. It's the same light, the same glory, but the very glory that is the fragrance of life to some is the smell of death to others. God's purpose is unfathomably kind. He will at the last so spread His life, being, and goodness that He will be all in all. He will at the last fill the universe with the light of His wonderful glory. He is all light, but that is terrible for those who love the darkness. In Ezekiel 1, the appearance of the glory also looks like a man, or as Hebrews 1:3 puts it, the sun, S-O-N, is the radiance of God's glory. That, in fact, is the reason why God's glory is outgoing and radiant, because it's a Trinitarian thing. The sun, the light of the world, is the splendor of the Father, the shining out of the Father's bright glory. As such, Jesus is the glory and weight of God. He goes out from the Father, exactly showing us just what the very being of the Father is like. And as Ezekiel saw, just like his Father is radiant. In fact, the Son is the radiance of his Father. Now, when we see that Jesus is the radiance of God's glory, it becomes impossible to think that God's glory is something that is not about love. Through Jesus, the Father shows us his innermost being in the form of a servant dying to give us life. And it is as Jesus comes to us from heaven, making himself nothing, that he displays his glory. That's what John 1:14 says. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. And we have seen his glory in his doing that, the glory of the one and only who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. Through Jesus, we do not see a proud divine glory, but the glory of inexpressible humility and kindness. Think of how Jesus showed his glory by turning water into the best wine. Then he was glorified by raising Lazarus from the dead. It's not that Jesus did those things to become a celebrity like some touring magician. It's that through those things he makes himself known as the compassionate one with the ability to heal and bring life and rich abundance. Then the Spirit glorified Christ by, as he says, taking from what is mine and making it known to you. That is, he shares, he's fruitful, and so makes his disciples fruitful, and this glorifies the Father. But all that's just a prelude to the hour of the glorification of Christ. In John 12, Jesus announced that the hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. What can he mean? Well, let's read more there in John 12. I tell you the truth, unless a grain of wheat falls to the ground and dies, it remains only a single seed. But if it dies, it produces many seeds. Now's the time for judgment on this world. Now the prince of the world will be driven out. But I, when I am lifted up from the earth, will draw all men to myself. He said this to show what kind of death he was going to die. Jesus is the glory of his Father shining out from the Father and perfectly enlightening us to see what the Father is really like. And now, Jesus himself in the upcoming cross is to be glorified. That is, we are now going to see his innermost being and weight displayed. What does it look like? A seed dying to bear fruit. For he was speaking of his death. Astonishingly, the moment when Jesus finally reaches the deepest point of his humiliation at the cross is the moment when he is most glorified and most clearly seen for who he is. On the cross, we see the glorification of the glory of God, the deepest revelation of the very heart of God. And it is all about laying down his life to give life to bear fruit. John Calvin said, in the cross of Christ, as in a magnificent theater, the inestimable goodness of God is displayed before the whole world. And all the creatures, indeed, both high and low, the glory of God shines, but nowhere has it shone more brightly than in the cross. Here is a glory no other God would want. Other gods need worship and service and sustenance, but this God needs nothing. He has life in himself, so much so that he's brimming over. His glory is good beyond measure, overflowing, self-giving. In 1882, Friedrich Nietzsche boldly announced the death of God, and by that he meant that belief in God was simply no longer viable. He meant it to be an end to all faith. In actual fact, though, God is dead is where true faith begins. For on the cross, Christ, the glory, puts to death all false ideas of God, and as he cries out to his Father and offers himself up by the Spirit, breathing out his last, he reveals a God beyond our dreams. Through the cross, we see a God who is infinitely better. There we do not see a God who does not care about our plight. We see one who personally deals with the root of it all. Jesus said he didn't come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. And so we come to where we started. Jesus Christ as the bright lane to knowledge of the true God. As the glorious Spirit-anointed Son, he reveals his Father. He reveals God to be Father, Son, and Spirit, and thus he reveals the only God who is love, and he shows us the true glory of that love on the cross. In him we see a God far beyond the bores and tyrants we all rush to reject. In him we see the good God. And how good he is. Amen.